Tonight we are continuing our study of what the Bible does and does not say about the end times, and I hope by now, if you're sitting here listening or if you're listening on video, that you have figured out the basic premise of what I'm saying is that most of the things that people expect to happen in our future are things that Jesus said would happen in the future of his listeners. And so we've talked about that, and we're working through Matthew 24. And now we're coming to a phrase that I'm going to spend the evening on out of the book of Matthew. But before I do, I want to talk about Texas for just a minute. I was teaching on this subject in another state, a state several states removed geographically from Texas. And I was trying to communicate this idea of handles in language, where we can take a word or a phrase and to the knowing listener, that word means a whole lot more than just those 5 or 6 letters. It has an entire story behind it. It has all kinds of ramifications to it. And so I was in another state teaching, and I was going to use an example of a phrase, and the phrase is, "Remember the Alamo." Well, if you're from Texas, that phrase has a whole history and names and places and background and consequences. And I kind of assumed that was the case everywhere in the United States, that everybody knows about the Alamo. So I said, let me give you an example. Remember the Alamo. And they were kind of nonplussed. And I said, you all know where the Alamo is. I mean, you know the Alamo. Yeah, there was a battle there. Where? Somebody tell me, where's the Alamo? Houston. I'm like, no. San Antonio. Can somebody name one of the 3 main leaders at the Alamo? Sam Houston. No. Sam Houston wasn't at the Alamo. How many died? We don't know. Who was the opposing general? Don't know. For a Texan? We had this grilled into us in grade school and in junior high. 7th grade history was Texas history. March 2nd, 1836, in San Antonio, Texas, 3 leaders, Jim Bowie, William B. Travis, Davy Crockett, and 186 men are in a little mission surrounded by between 2,000 and 3,000 Mexican soldiers under the forces of General Santa Anna, who destroys them, destroys the Alamo, kills them, burns their bodies, and is off on a quest to catch Sam Houston as he heads down the runaway scrape into East Texas. Everybody's saying Houston's a coward and fleeing and running away, but that tragic death at the Alamo and also at Goliad bought precious time for Sam Houston. And on the field of battle in San Jacinto, Sam Houston defeats Santa Anna and wins Texas liberty. And all of that is carried in the phrase, "Remember the Alamo." Now, I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But first of all, let me tell you about when I was 8 years old, and as a young East Texas boy, took a vacation with my family and my cousins to Anaheim, California, and we went to Disneyland. And the most memorable thing for me at Disneyland was this exhibit where Abraham Lincoln, a robot of Abraham Lincoln, a lifelike robot of Abraham Lincoln, walks out onto the stage and says, 407 years ago, and recites the Gettysburg Address. And of course, in retrospect, it wasn't lifelike at all. It was kind of cheesy, kind of corny. But man, to an 8-year-old East Texas boy in the 60s, that was scary, amazing, technological stuff. And it was sometime later that I was told that in the end times, the Antichrist was going to set up a statue in the temple. And it would be a living statue like that Abraham Lincoln statue. And people would worship it. And that was what Jesus was talking about when he used this phrase, the abomination of desolation. That was a long time ago, and I I totally abandoned that way of thinking when I was 24 years old, which was a long time ago. And so I don't really exactly remember how we came up with it, that it was going to be a statue, some kind of living statue. Somewhere, somehow, it had something to do with something in the book of Revelation about the beast receiving a mortal head wound and coming back to life. And that's all I remember about that. But the important thing is this abomination that causes desolation is going to be set up in the temple, and people are going to, the people who have taken the mark of the beast are going to worship this abomination instead of worshiping God. Here's the deal. Jesus isn't the first one to use the phrase abomination of desolation. And just like to a Texan, remember the Alamo has a whole story in those words. The abomination that causes desolation has a whole story in it for Jews, for Old Testament Jews, for first century Jews, for Jews that were schooled in the Old Testament. That wasn't just this curious phrase, well, I wonder what that means. No, it meant something to the Jews. The first time we see the phrase is in Daniel chapter 9, and I'll read it to you out of the King James Version, just for the heck of it. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifices and the oblations to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured out on the desolate. So that's the Daniel phrase. New American Standard says, on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. So there's this thing called the abomination of desolation that Jesus talks about in Matthew 24 when he's talking about what's going to be coming down on Jerusalem. But what you need to understand is this Daniel reference was fulfilled in 168 BC. 200 years plus before the destruction of Jerusalem. 150 years, 160 years before Jesus is even born, this was fulfilled. And it was fulfilled through this fellow named Antiochus Epiphanes. And even if you're not a history person, you may have heard of that name. He was a notable Greek ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes. But what you should know is his real name wasn't Antiochus Epiphanes. His real name was Mithridates. And when he became emperor, he chose for himself the name Antiochus Epiphanes, and you'll never guess what that that name means. It means God himself revealed. Pretty humble name to choose for yourself, wouldn't you say? What's your name? I'm God himself revealed. This is the name he chose for himself. And he controlled Israel, along with much of the rest of the Middle East. He decided to pass a law that said people could no longer worship Jehovah. They had instead to worship Zeus, of whom he was an incarnation. And when the Jews refused, Antiochus Epiphanes took his armies to Jerusalem and wiped it out, destroyed the city, killed tens of thousands of people, sold tens of thousands of Jews into slavery. There's a story in the Bible, if you have, pardon my humor here, if you have a whole Bible that has the book of Maccabees in it. The book of Maccabees is the story of this band of brothers who rise up and rebel and gain freedom from Antiochus Epiphanes. And by the way, that's where the celebration of Hanukkah comes from as well. You can read all about it. But my point is, Daniel speaks of the abomination of desolation. He's referring to Antiochus Epiphanes. So now we come to Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus says, verse 15, and then you will see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Let the reader understand. Wait a minute. Before we go any further, let's talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're not going to talk about John. We're going to talk about these three Gospels that are very, very similar. And in fact, they borrow complete sentences, complete paragraphs, complete stories, and they may tweak them a little bit here or there, but there's very much sharing of data. John is a completely different kind of gospel. These are called the synoptic because they see with the same optics, they see with the same eye, the synoptic gospels. And yet, Matthew is written to an audience. Mark is written to an audience. Luke is written to a different audience. And so they use different language and different words. Just like if I were trying to tell the story of the Alamo, I would say certain things to someone from Texas. I would say something else to someone from Georgia. Matthew is written to the Jews. And so it uses language that the Jews instantly understand. One phrase you will see in Matthew over and over and over that you won't see in the other Gospels is that it might be fulfilled according to the prophets. Because he's writing to Jewish people who know the prophets. And in this text that we're studying tonight, in Matthew 24, verse 15, when he says, and you shall see the abomination that causes desolation, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. That's like me saying to some Texas folk, this is the Alamo all over again. Y'all understand. He's talking in a language that to them has an entire story behind it. And what is the entire story? Holy smoke, these ungodly foreign armies came in and destroyed us. How did Jesus start out this conversation? I tell you, not one stone of this temple will be left upon another. What Jesus is saying is what happened with Antiochus 200 years ago is going to happen again. Something like that is going to happen again. And so our handy chart. In Matthew 24, written to the Jews, what is this thing? Well, we don't know, but it's an abomination. Where is it standing? In the holy place. And what does it cause? Desolation. Let me give you a definition. Abomination means something impure, something unholy, something evil. The abominable snowman. He's not just your, he's not Frosty. He's not your average, sweet, happy snowman with a corncob pipe. This is an abominable snowman. This is evil, wicked, scary. Something's wrong with him, unnatural. That's what abomination means. Desolation means desolation. It means destruction. It means to lay waste. Holy place. What could holy? Well, it could mean like the Holy of Holies in the temple. It could mean the temple itself. It could mean Israel. It could mean Jerusalem. It could mean a lot of different things. Depending on who you ask and what context, it could mean, the church you go to, the holy place, a little spot in your house that you've set aside for worship, a holy place. But in this context, it clearly has something to do with Israel and Jerusalem and the temple. So here's what we get from Matthew. Jesus says there is this abominable thing that is going to cause desolation when it is standing in the holy place. Let the reader understand. Nodding back to Daniel. Mark, the Gospel of Mark is the shortest gospel in the New Testament, only 16 chapters, and it is written to the Romans, to the Roman people, to a Roman culture, to Christians in Rome. And one of the key phrases that you see in the Gospel of Mark that you don't see in the others is the phrase straightway. Because Romans are just the facts, ma'am. Tell me and tell me quick, and don't elaborate on it, just tell me what happened. And so where Matthew will take 3 chapters to tell of the story of Jesus traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem, Mark will say, and straightway he went from Galilee to Jerusalem. And there are all these miracles and dead people being raised and parables that are just skipped over. Just the facts. So in the Mark version of this same sermon, this same teaching from Jesus, in Mark chapter 13, verse 14, he completely leaves out Daniel because Roman people don't know who Daniel is. Here's what Jesus says in Mark's version. But when you see the abomination, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not. Let the reader understand. So Mark replaces standing in the holy place with standing where it ought not. One more piece of information we've got. This thing, whatever it is, whoever it is standing in a place that is holy and in a place it does not belong. We still don't know what we're talking about because we're not Jews who are schooled in the story, and we're not first century believers who have some background. So let's turn to the third gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Luke is written to Gentiles. And let me say it like this to you and to you. If you aren't Jewish, you're Gentile. So everybody here, I'm assuming, is Gentile. You weren't schooled in the rabbinic traditions. You didn't memorize the Torah. You don't know all the Old Testament stories. Luke is written to Greeks. It's written to people who don't know squat about the Old Testament. People say, what's the first book a new Christian should read? Which gospel? And everybody goes to John. Oh, they ought to read John. And I think that's a terrible choice. John's a marvelous book. But it's a terrible choice because John is written to Christians who were already immersed in the faith. I think the best book for them to read is Luke, because it's written to Gentiles, it's written to Greeks, it's written to folk who do not know the story at all. And it tells the story, I think, best as an introductory. So let's see what Luke has to say about this abomination that causes desolation. These are the words from Luke chapter 21, same sermon, only Luke's version of it rather than Matthew's or Mark's. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near. Light bulbs, bing, bing, bing. When you see what? Armies. Where are they? Jerusalem. And what do they cause? Desolation. So, let's do a little historic math and put these all three together. It's not hard to figure out. What is the abomination that causes desolation? It is armies surrounding Jerusalem. This is not a 21st century event. This is not something Jesus is prophesying about the end of time or the end of history. This is something that Jesus was prophesying about in his own generation to the very people who were hearing him. Consequently, I'm going to go on and finish the passage. Consequently, he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. He's not talking to people living in California. He's not talking to people living in Mexico City. He's talking very geographically specific. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what is in his house. I'm just curious. How much time do the Swiss spend on their housetops? On those beautiful A-frame chalets? None. When's the last time you were on your housetop? Maybe to put up Christmas lights, but you don't go sit out in the evening and sit on your housetop and watch the sun go down unless you're in a Mediterranean clime or a Caribbean clime. You're somewhere where the flat roofs are, and you go maybe southern Florida, and you go and you've got a little porch there and you sit out in the cool of the evening. Jesus isn't writing globally. He's not speaking globally. He's speaking contextually about Israel. If you're in Judea, head for the hills. If you're on your housetop, get out of there. Don't even go down and pack a suitcase. Just go. If you're in the field, do not turn back and take your cloak. Alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Why? You know, in our day, it's still tough on pregnant women in our day, but on our day, if they need to leave in a hurry, hop in the car, turn on the AC, get out of there. Get on a plane. In first century, your city is being run over, you're pregnant, you're about to give birth, you can't run, you got to hop on a donkey or a bumpy wagon or something to escape. It's bad. It's not good. Pray that your flight does not happen in winter or on a Sabbath. What do we care if it happens on a Saturday? What do we care if we have to flee on a Sabbath? The Jews were forbidden by law, by their tradition, from going more than a mile on a Saturday, on a Sabbath. This is a Jewish context here, not a global context. And so the popular dispensational teaching that tells us the Great Tribulation is a future event, probably pretty soon, it's going to affect the entire world, is contrary to what Jesus is saying here in Matthew, Mark, and Luke when you consider them together. He's talking first century, localized. just to make sure everybody's on the same page, what we've said so far is that everything Jesus is describing in Matthew 24 is about the first century, about things that have already happened. And what has happened is popular eschatology, popular end times teachers have taken that and made it to be about our future, consequently putting fear and doubt and worry into the lives of Christians, and at best putting the hope of escape rather than the hope of victory. Oh, I just pray that Jesus will rapture me out of here before all of this happens, rather than the biblical and historic and sensible hope of glory that we have in the victory of the gospel happening on this earth. So that's all I have to say tonight. Next week, we're going to finally arrive at that famous phrase that this whole thing has been about, where Jesus says in the next verse, "For then there will be great tribulation." So join us next week as we talk about the past great tribulation. Thank you. God bless you.